The amber glow of the lantern cut through the shadows of the barn as Caleb Murphy stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on scattered hay, when suddenly a whispered gasp made him freeze. There, buried deep in the golden pile near the back wall, he glimpsed the edge of a torn blue dress, and a trembling hand pressed against scarred cheek. "Please don't tell my brother," came the barely audible plea from within the hay, and Caleb's heart clenched as he recognized Sarah Whitmore, the blacksmith's sister who hadn't been seen in town for months, her face bearing the cruel marks of flames that had stolen more than just her beauty. He set the lantern down carefully, its warm light dancing across her frightened eyes, and instead of the pity or disgust she clearly expected, he simply said, "Your hair's all tangled up with hay, Miss Sarah," reaching toward her not with grabbing hands, but with the gentleness of a man who understood that some souls had been broken enough. She flinched at first, then went perfectly still as his calloused fingers began working through the golden strands matted with straw, each touch so careful it was like he was handling spun silk. And for the first time since the fire that had marked her face and stolen her confidence, Sarah felt something other than shame wash over her. She felt safe. The lantern flickered as if blessing this moment, casting their shadows together on the barn wall while Caleb continued his patient work, removing each piece of hay as though he was unraveling years of pain. And when Sarah finally looked up at him through her tears, she saw not the revulsion she'd grown accustomed to seeing in mirrors, but something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. "There," he whispered when the last of the straw fell away, his hand lingering near her cheek but not quite touching the scarred skin. "Now you look like the angel you've always been." And Sarah's breath caught in her throat because nobody had called her anything close to beautiful since the night the blacksmith shop caught fire and changed everything. 6 months had passed since the night Sarah Whitmore's world turned to ash and flame, the memory still vivid of how she'd run back into the burning blacksmith shop to save the neighbor's little girl who'd wandered inside, emerging with the child safe, but her own face forever marked by the cruel kiss of fire that left twisted scars along her left cheek and down her neck. Her brother Thomas had been grateful beyond words for her heroism, but Sarah saw how his eyes now struggled to meet hers, how he stumbled over compliments that once came easily, and worst of all, how he'd started accepting dinner invitations from the widow Henderson with increasing frequency, leaving Sarah alone with her shame and her mirrors covered in cloth. The townspeople whispered their mixture of admiration and pity, calling her brave one moment and crossing to the other side of the street the next, their children staring with the innocent cruelty that only youth could muster, until Sarah found herself leaving the house only for supplies, and always with a bonnet pulled low to hide what the flames had stolen. She'd taken to hiding in the barn behind their property whenever visitors came calling, especially when she spotted Caleb Murphy's horse tied outside, because she'd harbored feelings for the gentle cowboy long before the fire and couldn't bear to see the inevitable disappointment in his eyes when he truly saw what she'd become. The hay had become her refuge, a place where she could disappear entirely and pretend that somewhere in the world there was still a version of herself worth loving, where she could remember what it felt like to dream about marriage and children, and a future that didn't involve shadows and shame. But tonight, lost in her thoughts and the comfort of her hiding place, she hadn't heard his approach until the lantern light found her, and now here she sat with hay-tangled hair and tears on her cheeks, caught between the urge to run and the dangerous hope blooming in her chest as Caleb's gentle hands worked magic she'd forgotten was possible. The lantern's glow seemed to wrap around them like a golden cocoon, protecting this moment from the harsh world outside. And for the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over after all. Thomas Whitmore had always been a man of iron and fire, But since his sister's accident, he'd become something harder. Protective to the point of fierce, turning away suitors with the intensity of a guard dog, convinced that no man could truly want Sarah for anything more than curiosity about her scars, or pity that would eventually turn to resentment. He'd seen how the banker's son had stared during Sunday service, watched how the merchant's eyes lingered not on Sarah's remaining beauty, but on the twisted skin that told her story of sacrifice. And each look had hardened Thomas's resolve that his sister was better off alone than settling for less than genuine love. Caleb Murphy had been coming around more often lately, always with reasonable excuses, needing tools repaired, asking about horseshoes, commissioning metalwork for his ranch. But Thomas wasn't fooled by the cowboy's transparent attempts to catch glimpses of Sarah, who seemed to vanish like smoke whenever visitors appeared. "She's been through enough," Thomas had warned Caleb just last week, his hammer striking the anvil with unnecessary force. "And I won't have her hurt again by some man who thinks he's doing charity work." Words that had made Caleb's jaw tighten with something that might have been anger or determination. What Thomas didn't know was that Caleb had been in love with Sarah Whitmore since long before the fire, had spent months working up the courage to court her properly, and had been planning to ask for her hand the very week tragedy struck and changed everything, including her willingness to be seen by anyone, especially him. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Caleb that the fire had stolen not just Sarah's confidence, but his chance to prove that his feelings ran deeper than surface beauty, that he'd fallen in love with her gentle spirit and quick wit, and the way she hummed while hanging laundry, completely unaware that he watched from his horse at the property line like a lovesick fool. Now, sitting in the hay-scented darkness with Sarah's golden hair flowing through his fingers like liquid silk, Caleb felt the weight of all those lost months, all those missed opportunities to show her that scars could never diminish the light that made her who she was. And he silently vowed that tonight would mark the beginning of making up for lost time. The lantern flickered, as if agreeing with his determination, its warm glow illuminating not just Sarah's face, but the hope that was slowly, carefully beginning to bloom between them like a flower that had been waiting all winter for the right conditions to grow. "I used to think God had favorites," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft sounds of night settling around the barn. "People he made beautiful and whole, people he planned good things for, and then there were the rest of us, waiting for our turn that never comes." Caleb's hands stilled in her hair, his heart breaking at the defeat in her voice, the way she spoke about herself as if she were somehow less deserving of love and happiness than anyone else. And he found himself leaning closer, his breath warm against her temple as he struggled to find words that could bridge the chasm of pain she'd built around herself. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been wanting to tell you something for a long time, since before—" But she pulled back sharply, her scarred hand flying to cover her cheek, as if she could hide the evidence of the fire's cruel touch, shaking her head with the desperate certainty of someone who'd convinced herself that certain dreams were no longer possible. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the barn walls, and in its flickering light, Caleb saw not just her scars, but the fear behind them. The bone-deep belief that she was now somehow broken beyond repair. And it made something fierce and protective rise in his chest because she clearly had no idea how wrong she was. "Don't you dare pity me, Caleb Murphy," she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears tracked down her cheeks. "I won't be anybody's good deed or their chance to feel noble about loving something damaged." And the pain in her words hit him like a physical blow because she truly believed that's all she could ever be to anyone now. He reached for the lantern, lifting it so its warm glow fell directly across both their faces, forcing her to see the truth in his eyes when he spoke his next words. "Sarah Whitmore, I have been in love with you since the day I watched you give your lunch to old Mrs. Peterson's hungry grandchildren, Since the afternoon you spent an hour helping that lost calf find its mother, since every Sunday when you sang hymns like you were having a conversation with angels. His voice growing stronger with each word, because finally, he was saying what had been burning in his heart for months. The lantern trembled slightly in his grip, its light catching the surprised wonder that was slowly replacing the fear in Sarah's eyes. And Caleb knew that whatever happened next would change everything between them forever. The truth hung between them like morning mist, delicate and shifting, as Sarah stared at Caleb with the expression of someone who'd been offered something too precious to believe. Her scarred hand slowly falling away from her cheek, as if she was too stunned to remember to hide anymore. "You don't mean that," she breathed. But even as she said it, something in his steady gaze was making her heart hammer against her ribs, like a caged bird suddenly remembering how to fly. "You can't mean that, not now, not when I'm—" But Caleb set the lantern down and reached for both her hands, his calloused palms warm and sure as they enveloped her trembling fingers. "The fire didn't change who you are, Sarah," he said with quiet intensity, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her knuckles. "It didn't change your kindness or your courage or the way you make everything around you better just by existing. And it sure didn't change how I feel about you." Words that made her breath catch, because no one had spoken to her like this since before the accident, like she was still whole and worthy and deserving of such fierce tenderness. She wanted to believe him. Could feel herself leaning into the hope he was offering like a flower turning toward sunlight. But then a sound from outside made them both freeze, the unmistakable crunch of boots approaching the barn, and Sarah's face went pale as moonlight because she recognized that determined stride as belonging to her brother Thomas. "He'll be furious," she whispered, panic flooding her voice as she tried to pull her hands free. "He's so protective now, he thinks every man who looks at me twice is either cruel or lying, and he'll never believe that you could actually—" But Caleb's grip tightened gently, anchoring her to this moment, to this truth that was still so new and fragile between them. The barn door creaked on its hinges, and Thomas Whitmore's silhouette appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders backlit by starlight, his blacksmith's hammer still gripped in one hand as if he'd come straight from his forge. And when his eyes adjusted to the lantern light and he saw his sister sitting in the hay with Caleb Murphy's hands holding hers, his face went through a series of expressions that ranged from surprise to suspicion to something that might have been protective fury. "What exactly is going on here?" Thomas demanded, his voice carrying the weight of months of worry and fierce love for his sister. And Sarah felt her newfound hope begin to crumble because she knew that look in her brother's eyes. It was the same expression he wore when he was about to make a decision that would protect her, whether she wanted it or not. "Thomas, please," Sarah began. But her brother's attention was fixed entirely on Caleb, his grip tightening on the hammer's handle as he took a step deeper into the barn, the lantern light catching the steel in his eyes and the set of his jaw that meant he was prepared for a fight. "I told you to stay away from her," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you she'd been through enough without having to deal with men who think they can toy with her feelings or satisfy their curiosity about what it's like to court a scarred woman." And each word landed like a blow, making Sarah flinch and wrap her arms around herself as if she could physically shield her heart from the implication that she was now something to be pitied or experimented with, rather than genuinely loved. Caleb rose slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate, never taking his eyes off Thomas but positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. "Thomas, you've got it all wrong," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the barn like electricity before a storm. "I'm not here out of pity or curiosity. I'm here because I love your sister, have loved her long before the fire, and I'm asking for your permission to court her properly." The words seemed to hit Thomas like a physical force, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something that might have been cautious hope. Because in all the months since Sarah's accident, no man had approached him with such straightforward honesty, and certainly none had spoken of love with the kind of conviction that rang in Caleb's voice like a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched her brother's face. Saw the war between his protective instincts and his desire for her happiness playing out in the set of his shoulders, the way his grip on the hammer loosened just slightly as he truly looked at Caleb Murphy for the first time, not as a potential threat, but as a man who might actually be worthy of his sister's heart. "You say you loved her before," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Then where were you when she needed someone to tell her she was still beautiful, still worth something, still deserving of a future that didn't involve hiding in barns and covering mirrors?" The question hung in the air like smoke from his forge. And Sarah held her breath as she waited for Caleb's answer, because she realized that this moment would determine not just whether her brother would accept him, but whether she could trust her heart to hope again. Caleb's face went pale in the lantern light, and for a moment the only sound was the soft rustle of hay as Sarah shifted beside him, her eyes fixed on his profile as if she could read the answer to Thomas's challenge in the line of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides like he was fighting some internal battle. "I was a coward," Caleb admitted finally, his voice rough with self-recrimination. "I stayed away because I was afraid that seeing pity in my eyes would hurt her more than not seeing me at all, afraid that I'd say the wrong thing or make her feel like a charity case. When the truth is, I should have been here every day telling her that the fire changed nothing about how I feel." Thomas's expression softened slightly at this unexpected honesty, recognizing the kind of painful truth that only came from a man examining his own failures. But Sarah was staring at Caleb with something that looked like wonder mixed with hurt, because she was finally understanding that all those months of isolation hadn't been because no one cared, but because the one person whose opinion mattered most had been struggling with his own fears about how to love her properly. "I thought you were disgusted," she whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the barn's shadows. "I thought you couldn't bear to look at me anymore. That's why you stopped coming by, why you only visited when I wasn't around." And the pain in her words made both men wince, because they could hear years of loneliness and self-doubt concentrated into that single confession. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her in the hay, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness, his thumbs careful as they traced the edges of her scars, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for precious things. "Sarah, I could never be disgusted by you, not if I lived 1,000 years, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "These marks just prove what I already knew, that you're braver than anyone has a right to be, that you'd risk everything to save someone else, that you're exactly the kind of woman I want to spend my life loving." The lantern flickered between them, casting their joined shadows on the barn wall like a promise, and Thomas watched this display of genuine emotion with the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, his sister had found the kind of man who could see past surface damage to the treasure underneath. The kind of love that could heal what the fire had broken in ways that had nothing to do with scarred skin. "If I give you my blessing," Thomas said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of a brother's love and concern, "you'll need to prove to me that you understand what you're asking for. Sarah's been hurt enough for one lifetime, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again." The challenge in Thomas's voice hung heavy in the air, like the scent of hay and lantern oil, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched Caleb consider his response, knowing that whatever happened next would shape not just her future, but her brother's willingness to let her choose her own path toward happiness or heartbreak. "What would you have me do?" Caleb asked quietly, his hands still cradling Sarah's face with infinite care, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was prepared to move mountains if necessary to prove his worthiness. To show both siblings that his love was built on bedrock rather than shifting sand. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his blacksmith's mind working through the problem like he was designing a particularly complex piece of metalwork, weighing and measuring and testing for weak points. And when he finally spoke, his words carried the gravity of a man who'd spent months watching his sister retreat from the world and was desperate to see her rejoin it. "The harvest dance is next Saturday," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. "Half the county will be there. And Sarah hasn't been to a social gathering since the accident. Won't even consider it, no matter how much I've tried to convince her." And Sarah's stomach dropped because she could see where this was leading, could feel the familiar panic rising in her chest at the thought of all those staring eyes and whispered comments. "Take her to the dance," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. "Not hidden away in some corner, but right out in the open where everyone can see that you're proud to be with her. That you're not ashamed or embarrassed or treating her like some secret you need to keep." And the test was so perfectly, terrifyingly appropriate that Sarah wanted to disappear into the hay and never emerge. Caleb's hands tightened slightly on her face, not possessively but reassuringly, and when he looked into her eyes, she saw no hesitation, no doubt, only a quiet determination that made her heart skip like a stone across water. "I'd be honored to escort Miss Whitmore to the dance," he said formally, never breaking eye contact with her even as he addressed Thomas. "And I'd be proud to have every person in that room see that I'm the luckiest man alive." The lantern seemed to glow brighter at his words, as if even the flame approved of this declaration. But Sarah was shaking her head before he finished speaking, because the thought of facing the entire community with her scars on display, of enduring their stares and whispers while pretending to dance and smile, was more terrifying than any fire. "I can't," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking on the words as she pulled back from Caleb's touch, wrapping her arms around herself like armor that couldn't possibly be strong enough to protect her from what her brother was asking. "Thomas, you know I can't face all those people. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They'll stare and whisper and pity me, and I won't be able to bear it." The fear in her voice was so raw, so absolute, that both men felt it like a physical blow. And Caleb found himself thinking of all the times he'd seen her before the fire. Laughing at church socials, dancing with abandon at community gatherings, lighting up every room she entered with a joy that seemed to emanate from her very soul. And he realized that Thomas's test wasn't just about proving Caleb's commitment, but about giving Sarah back a piece of herself that the fire had stolen along with her unblemished skin. "What if they do stare?" Caleb said gently, moving closer to her again, despite her retreat. "What if they whisper and wonder and even pity you? Does that change who you are inside? Does it make you less worthy of love and happiness and a life lived in the light instead of shadows?" His words were like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach something deep inside her, and Sarah found herself looking up at him through tears, because no one had challenged her fears so directly, so compassionately, since the accident that had changed everything. Thomas watched this exchange with growing understanding, seeing how Caleb's presence seemed to kindle something in his sister that had been dormant for months. A spark of the woman she'd been before tragedy tried to convince her she was less than whole. And he realized that maybe his test wasn't cruel after all. Maybe it was exactly what they both needed to move forward. "I'll be right there beside you," Caleb promised, his voice steady as bedrock. "And if anyone dares to make you uncomfortable, they'll answer to me. But Sarah, you can't let fear make your decisions forever. You saved a child's life, you're a hero, and it's time the world saw you standing tall and proud instead of hiding in hay." The lantern's flame danced between them, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the war between hope and terror playing out in Sarah's heart. And she found herself thinking of the little girl she'd saved. How that child was now running and playing and living a full life because Sarah had been brave when it mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to be brave again. "If I say yes," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in autumn wind, "if I go to that dance and let everyone see what I've become, you have to promise me something, Caleb Murphy. You have to promise that if you change your mind, if seeing their reactions makes you realize what you'd be taking on, you'll tell me honestly instead of letting me believe in something that isn't real." Caleb's response came without hesitation, his voice ringing through the barn with the kind of certainty that moved mountains and changed destinies. "Sarah Whitmore, I promise you this. I will never change my mind about loving you, not if the whole world stares, not if they whisper until their tongues fall out, not if they question my sanity or my eyesight." And he reached for the lantern, lifting it high so its golden light fell across both their faces like a blessing. "This light," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "has been my witness tonight to the truth I should have spoken months ago, that you are beautiful, scars and all, that you are brave beyond measure, and that I would rather spend one dance with you than a lifetime with anyone else." And as he spoke, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. A wall that had been built from fear and shame, beginning to crumble under the steady pressure of his unwavering devotion. Saturday night arrived with autumn's crisp promise, and when Caleb appeared at the Whitmore door dressed in his finest clothes, Sarah was waiting in a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her golden hair and made her scarred skin look like it had been kissed by starlight rather than marked by tragedy. Her chin held high with newfound courage, borrowed from the memory of lantern light and gentle hands combing hay from her hair. The harvest dance was in full swing when they arrived, the community hall alive with music and laughter, and yes, there were stares and whispers when they walked through the door. But Caleb kept his hand steady on her waist, his proud smile never wavering as he led her onto the dance floor where they moved together like they'd been partners all their lives. As they danced, Sarah noticed something magical happening. The stares of curiosity gradually transformed into looks of admiration, because seeing her courage, her grace, her obvious joy in Caleb's arms reminded everyone present of who she'd always been. The woman who'd risk everything for others, who'd faced fire and emerged not broken, but tempered like the finest steel her brother could forge. The lantern from that night in the barn now sat in a place of honor on their mantle, a wedding gift from Thomas, who had watched his sister bloom back to life like a flower that had simply been waiting for the right gardener, and Elias Redfeather smiled as he finished recording this tale of love found in shadows and celebrated in light. Knowing that sometimes the most beautiful stories began not with perfection, but with the courage to let someone see your scars and call them beautiful anyway. In a time when healing came not from hiding, but from being held, when love proved stronger than fear, and when a simple lantern could illuminate the truth that some bonds are forged in fire and emerge more precious than gold.